Good evening, everyone. I am Brian Culp. I'm a professor at Kennesaw State University, and you are tuned into our session on anti-racist teaching and HPE. We have a great panel discussion that is available for you this evening with some panelists that I will introduce to you in a minute. First things first, since we are dealing with time, let's go ahead and go over the agenda real quick so we can know kind of where we're set. The first thing is that we're going to define anti-racist and anti-racism. So that'll be our first discussion. The second thing we'll do is we'll introduce everyone to the panel. The third thing that we'll do is have a panel discussion. Please put your questions in the chat. And one thing I'll mention is that, I'll be monitoring the chats as we sort of move on here and also the panelists as well. So some of the things in the chat we'll answer in chat, and then some of the things that we think may be common themes we'll answer as sort of a bigger group. Let's have our breakout room discussions. We'll do it after the panel discussion that we'll have. And then last but not least, about 7:05 or so, we'll do a readout from the breakout rooms and then have a wrap up. And I see Gregory Brown here saying, nice to see Georgia represented. Absolutely. Make sure you send me an email afterwards. Maybe we can kind of catch up and kind of figure out what's going on. So let's go ahead and get started with the definition of anti-racist and anti-racism. So anti-racist and anti-racism, and there are a lot of different definitions. When we were preparing for this a couple of days ago, the group panel, as you can probably represent a lot of people with some expertise here, and you tend to find that there's probably 10 or 12 different definitions of anti-racist versus anti-racism. And we have to recognize the fact that these things have changed since like 1970s or so. But in the definitions, we pretty much came to a consensus on a couple different things. So anti-racist is a belief, practice, or actions that actively opposes and works against racism and racial discrimination. Key word there is actively opposes. The work of an anti-racist involves challenging and supporting the dismantling of systemic and individual biases, prejudices, and structures that perpetuate inequality based on race. Anti-racism includes recognizing individual racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, and structural racism. Now, if you don't have an idea of what those things are, you're in the right place, because I'm going to go over those real quickly before we get to our discussion. So here are the types of racisms that's generally found in the literature and generally found in types of things that we see in society. The first is individual. So an individual's racist assumptions, beliefs, or behaviors, and it's a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious, unconscious, and personal prejudice. The second type of racism we generally find is interpersonal racism. So that occurs between individuals. These are public expressions of racisms, often involving slurs, biases, hateful words, or actions. The third type of racism is the one we've probably heard much more of in the past few years, and it's institutional or systemic racism. These are defined as policies and practices that exist throughout a whole society or organization, and that result in and support a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race. And finally, we have structural. Structural is a system of organizational and institutional policies that have been created and cultivated over time that support a continued unfair advantage for some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on their race or ethnic groups. So we've got the four different types of racism. And as I said, for the scope of today, if we really wanted to get more detailed, you could probably tease these out and kind of look at some other different examples over our history. And really, to be honest with you, that are the things that are currently happening right now. But we wanted to give some time to have some bigger discussions today. So our esteemed panel that we have with us here are three experts and a moderator. And if you figured it out by now, I'm the person moderating. So our first is Tilsa Rodriguez-Gonzalez. She is the Supervisor of Health and Physical Education in the City School District of New Rochelle, New York. We have Dr. Victor Ramsey, who's an Adjunct Assistant Professor at York College, the City University of New York. We have Ronny Rodriguez, who's elementary physical education teacher at Dos Puentes Elementary School, New York City Department of Education. And as I mentioned before, I'm Dr. Brian Culp from Kennesaw State University. So I think, as we mentioned before, we're going to have an opportunity to ask about 4 or 5 questions. And I would also encourage you to, again, participate in the chat. We're going to run a few minutes here with our questions, and then we will proceed to going to our breakout sessions where we can talk in more detail. But I'm really excited to have these 3 professionals here, and I think we're going to get a lot out of it. So for our panel discussion, let's go ahead and go to our first question, which means that I am going to stop sharing here and get out into big group with everyone else. The first question we have for the panel, and we will start with Tilsa first. The first question is, what do you think are some characteristics of an anti-racist physical education teacher?
Great question. Characteristics of an anti-racist physical education teacher. I think the most important thing is not to say that you don't see color, because that is what makes people unique. And when we think about why we're in this situation and the idea of colorism and what it represented in the past, it is very important to honor the fact that being an anti-racist is not just, you know, gazing over something and saying and belittling it. Honoring where children come from, honoring games that they may play at home, honoring things and attributes that they bring with them into the classroom, I think is incredibly important. And so if we bring that to the scope of pedagogy, sometimes it's important when you do get to know the children, you may want to use a tool such as an anticipatory guide. I know that's very common in social studies, but it can be used in physical education as well. You may want to survey the children. You may want to ask them, well, what are some things that you play? What are some interests that you have? And in doing so, incorporating it into your class and realizing that some neighborhood games are fun games that can be incorporated into the classroom, because at the end of the day, it really is honoring physical literacy and helping children understand that they can move, they can jump, they can play, and they can do it in school. They can make friends. And this will also help break down barriers. Sometimes in classrooms, you have children that remain isolated, and you have children that may not necessarily find out where they fit. And I'm not just talking about African-American children. I'm talking about children from places in parts of the Mediterranean that come here. I'm talking about children that come from even places in Europe. And so when you think about a melting pot, some people might be racist against newcomers, and you know, it might not just be a dark-skinned person. So being an anti-racist teacher is someone who really takes the time to develop relationships and get to know the children, and then uses physical activity and the concepts of physical literacy to help build community. And when building community, it helps to break down barriers, because when children play together, a lot of times they're just playing. They don't know what's going on in different parts of the world. And the idea of, I mean, I remember I grew up in the Bronx. We used to have bottle caps and we used to fill them with things, and kids used to play. That was a, you know, that was a little game. Some people might say that that didn't have value, but find value in what children bring, find value in their uniqueness, find value in some of the games they make up that are a part of their imagination, that are part of the history. You know, there are games and there are sports that we play right now that are not originally sports and games that came from the mainstream America that we are looking at now. And when we look at who plays it now, well, you know, that brings us into a little bit of a deeper scope, but the idea is to honor who people are. So being an anti-racist is honoring who, yes, Scully's. Thank you, Kara. I couldn't remember the name. Honor who people are, bring it into the classroom, allow it to bridge some gaps, and allow it to let people get to know each other. In doing so, rather than allowing and perpetuating ideas that even seep into socioeconomic barriers, allow it to really build a sense of community. So, and that's something that I encourage all the time.
Very good. Very powerful answer. Look at that. So we've got a next person, and we're going to be going around just in the same circle here. Ronnie, same question. What are some of the characteristics of an anti-racist physical education teacher, in your opinion?
Awesome, thank you. In my opinion, to be an anti-racist physical education teacher, it means that you are, in fact, an anti-racist human being, because the beliefs, experiences, and perceptual lens through which we view reality pours itself into every environment that we are. It is not merely that we say the things that are politically correct, because that is we speak to ensure that safety and that we create community amongst all of the human beings that we come into contact with. A school is made up of a multiple layer of human beings, stemming from, most importantly, the children who were there to educate, the educators who are there, the administrators, the staff who make sure that the facilities and everything associated with the building running is operating at full force, and district and the larger neighborhood beyond. So an educator who takes on the mantra, the scope of being racist, means that you as a human being you've taken the time to reflect on your own biases. You've taken the time to reflect on the history and context in which you yourself teach it. And through that, make meaningful connections with the students in front of you, that they have a meaningful physical education experience that translates to them being contributing, positive, compassionate, empathetic members of this society, that they understand that no human being is better than any other human being on the basis of any of the socially constructed mechanisms to control one another. So again, I think everything related to being anti-racist will stem back to your own level of self-awareness. So speaking of social, emotional competencies, you yourself have put yourself through that entire scope, and thus can embody and show through your own lived experience what it means to view yourself as a human being and grant that humanity to other human beings as well. I hope that that helps answer the question without going too deep into nuances, which I would say for later through questions from the panel. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
That was excellent. Nothing wrong with deep. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Ramsey, see what you can add on to those two excellent responses we've had.
Oh, yes, for sure. Thank you so much. And great question. In fact, my addition to that is an anti-racist pedagogue, advocates, have a social justice advocacy that is anti-racist in the sense that is beyond, not only in the physical education setting, but beyond, because we're preparing our students for the future, our students to have a seat at the table. My esteemed colleagues talk about creating safe spaces where students' languages, students' diverse cultures, and those traits related to the different ethnic groups are respected, not tolerated, but respected in our inclusive environment. Having a cultural sensitivity. When you don't know, you don't know. So there's nothing wrong with asking. I've had a plethora of examples where we have had individuals who have missteps about what it means to embrace all students in the classroom. Sometimes we think that we're doing that. In essence, we may not be. But when you don't know, you don't know. So having a cultural sensitivity where that you are not only embracing, but celebrating diversity and the traditions of your students. In fact, when hearing about students' background, sometimes it brings you to situations or a space whereby you as a teacher learn about that student's background, and therefore to echo what Ronnie said, we're talking about building community and only building relationship and trusting relationship with our students. Having also, very importantly, is collaborating with our colleagues in our environment. Oftentimes, we tend to live in these silos. So I think that physical educators should welcome and again, embrace their colleagues, and when given opportunities to share something that may or may not be appropriate within the setting that they're in, to share it with them, with their colleagues, so and administrators and the school community as a whole. So these, in addition to what my colleague said, I believe is characteristics, having a culturally responsive teaching and learning lens, by where, again, to echo Tilsa's response, in that you are addressing and including activities that students can relate to, and certainly addressing inequities that you may find in the class, and taking every opportunity to address these, and again, through the teaching lens, so that you can make this a better place for all students, and again, preparing them for the future, and of course, to be better human beings.
Well, excellent. If you're paying attention, that's just the first question. So we've got this panel throwing fastballs already. And yeah, there's really nothing else I can say to that. Some of you probably been paying attention. I've been sitting here trying to write notes for myself to kind of keep up, but we're gonna go ahead and move to the second question. Second question is a little bit more personal. All of us here have been teachers of various lengths, and we have different challenges that we've dealt with over the course of our careers. So the second question deals with that. The second question is, what challenges or experiences have you encountered when students raise inequities or concerns about racial disparities in their classes? And how did you address those challenges? And even to some extent, what did you learn from the lesson? And we'll start with Tilsa.
Thank you. So I've been in my district currently going on 7 years. And one of the first things as I did as the supervisor is I did my own deep dive. And my own deep dive included an analysis of what's going on where. So we have several different zip codes in our school district. And previously, we have been cited. The school district has a history with being cited for issues that pertain to conflicts related to race. And so I took it upon myself to take a deep dive into, well, are there any equity issues when it comes to schools in different neighborhoods in the community? And in doing so, I have determined that my budget, which I did advocate for because I previously didn't have a budget, but this was actually the platform for which helped me advocate for monies to be able to just focus on physical education. And what's unique about my role is that I am one of one. I am one Latina female in my area that is solely responsible for curriculum and instruction for physical education. So the fact that my school district felt it important to separate the role of the athletic director and the supervisor for health and physical education speaks volumes. So how I spend my time says a lot about what we care about as a district. And so in my deep dive, I was able to then return with information about equipment at the different schools and how that impacted children's ability in one neighborhood to be exposed to experience as opposed to another community. Now, it's all part of the same small city, but they all funnel into the same high school. So therefore, when you look at what then happens when it comes to athletics and who then becomes team members and who makes teams, well, that's important data to think about. That's important because some parents can afford to give their children private lessons. Some parents, and there's nothing wrong with that. I do that for my children. I spend money on whatever. However, it's also important to provide opportunities for those children whose parents cannot. So therefore, that is an equity issue. And so part of the spending and the advocacy in my role has been to be able to say, well, this school does not have an archery set. This school does not have, for example, lacrosse sticks. And so when it comes to the moment for me to defend my budget, those are the things that I look for. That's how I match it up. So at my level, I look to, well, what are the different experiences that children are going to have that will then afford them the opportunity and exposure to something that perhaps their parent cannot afford, that is not available in this part of the community, that they cannot be bused to, that, you know, for whatever reason is not available to them. And then when they funnel into one high school, and then we have, and I will say, Rochelle is an amazing community, and we have an amazing sports program, but it needs to be fair who's on those teams. And so in the past, that is the approach that I have taken, because I felt like that was one specific impact that I could make, and I continue to make it. And archery was one example of something that I did to support children so that every secondary school has an archery program, and the teachers were also trained on that.
Thank you very much. We'll move to Ronny.
Awesome. My experience, this is my going into my 15th year. And hopefully for those of you who stated that my connection was a little bad before, I switched to my phone, so hopefully I can sound a little bit clearer now. In essence, this is my 15th year as a New York City Department of Education teacher. 6 of those years were spent at the Sheridan Academy for Young Leaders. I was fortunate enough to be a founding member of one of the schools that unfortunately is deeply segregated. So the bulk, even though it was deeply segregated, deeply diverse, everyone under the race construct would be labeled as Black, Hispanic, but look deeper in terms of the countries of origin and different backgrounds, it was extremely diverse school. Within that context, I had to create a program that did not exist. There was no physical education program. The experience that the community had prior to that was a dismal experience, to be honest. So I had to start from the very ground level. And I myself, being a new teacher during that time, just recently graduated from Cortland, which is near Syracuse, completely different context and under which I was taught under. And it was a lot of growing pains and learning pains. However, through working with the various stakeholders within the school community and continuing to strive to provide those students with the best physical education experience that I possibly could, it developed into a high functioning physical education program, wellness program that extended beyond my physical education classroom and well into the community. So the overcoming of the lack of resources, lack of a history of quality PE was through my own development, my own connection with the students there, and going above and beyond the call of duty to ensure that that community valued movement, valued themselves, and that I could be a model, because I myself am an immigrant. I was brought over to this country by my mom by the time I was 8 years old, 3rd grade. So the first portion of my life, of my educational experience, my coming into existence, was in a 3rd world country, the Dominican Republic. To that end, after 6 years at Sheridan Academy, I became an instructional coach for the Central Office of School Wellness Programs. And under the revolutionary historic initiative, PE Works, the mayor allocated $100 million for New York City public schools to advance physical education, to make it more equitable and accessible. We hired new PE teachers. I was part of hiring committees, equity rationales, and had to ensure that our practices and the things that we were doing as it related to student curriculum practices even things within our own office as to how we dealt with each other. I was at the forefront of that, and fortunately, I met, Dr. Victor Ramsey, who has been a mentor, a brother, a friend, and now beyond colleagues. We're really close, and those were the things that helped me overcome some of the barriers that you could imagine. Me in my own personal life in this country, as well as being physical education teacher with an anti-racist agenda, moving through the different layers. Currently, I'm back at the elementary school level at a bilingual school, Dos Puentes Elementary, and this is truly a diverse school. In this school, we have students from all backgrounds, students who predominantly Hispanic, but also we have a large Jewish population, white students, African-American students. So truly school that can be used as an exemplar of what integration should be looking like in the current 2023 United States of America. Very fortunate. We also do dual language. So I teach a lot of classes in Spanish, and it's helped me to connect deeper with my own roots, because for a long time, again, as I stated earlier, the characteristics of being an anti-racist teacher is that you're an anti-racist human being. So you have to truly understand where it is that you are coming from, how you show up in the context that you teach, the history of this country, and how that imparts on all the human beings that are in front of you. So the personal struggles I've gone through are systemic for the most part, but I've overcome it through my own persistence, perseverance, and understanding of myself to be able to show up as strong as I can for myself and for those who are sometimes voiceless. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Ramsey.
Yes, my experience have been a little more personal. I am going to share a personal experience and then juxtapose that with a comment that I saw in the chat, and I'll make the connection for you. So during my early inception as a physical educator, I recall, for those of you who are students of history like me, there was a atrocity that occurred in Oklahoma City. You may recall that there was a bombing that occurred in Oklahoma City that sadly many people died in this bombing, and there was sadly a number of children that died from a daycare. So during the time that occurred, my administrators asked the teachers to pair off and go into several classrooms to sort of hear what the children had to say about what had occurred, sort of so address how they feel about how was their emotions at that time. So there was a novice teacher that I was paired off with, and I had her take the lead to sort of facilitate the conversation among the children. And during the conversation, one of the students made a statement, and that statement was, "We should go bomb them back. We should go back and bomb them." And mind you, this was a middle school group of students. And the teacher then said, "Yes, we should go and bomb them." So at that time, being in maybe my seventh year, I believe it was my seventh year, I don't recall, fifth, seventh year, I don't recall teaching. I had to intervene immediately. And then I asked, I said, to the student, I said, when you say bomb them, who are you referring to? And the student said, the Muslims. And mind you, within that classroom, I had Muslim students in there. And you can only imagine how that atmosphere was at the time. So again, teachable moment. And I had to immediately address it to students in a manner in which they will, before even jumping to conclusions, take a step back and say, let us be very mindful of when we mention other ethnic groups or people from a different country or religious background before we make any type of assumptions. Well, fast forward, we learned that it was a white supremacist. For those of you who recall, it was Timothy McVeigh and one of his co-conspirators who were committing this atrocity. So again, this is an example of the type of missteps that I have encountered in my personal, and I have many others to share. I want to juxtapose that with a comment that was made in the chat when someone said they heard an accent. And I just want you to know, as a higher ed instructor, that is one of the things that I try to bring to the forefront with my students, whereby we all have an accent. We all have an accent. So no matter if you're from New York, from Brooklyn, you have a different accent from someone from the Bronx. If you are from the Caribbean person is hearing a different accent because you came from America, and vice versa. So that's one of the things that I try to incorporate within my teaching environment, again, for my future professionals, so that they can avoid these missteps into saying that, oh, you have an accent, because we all have an accent. So these are tiny little nuances, and I believe issues related to language was addressed. So that's one of the things that I try to bring to the forefront in a manner in which people will, future professionals will say, hey, look, that's something that could happen to me, or that might be a situation that I might find myself in. For example, people may see me sometimes in the manner in which I dress, the manner in which I speak, and make assumptions. Well, I am Afro-Latino. I came from a Spanish-speaking country. So again, people tend to judge us even on how we look and maybe how we sound. So that's one of the things that I try to help people to be very cautious of not having that misstep. So I just want to make that point. And again, I have other issues and situations that I've been through, but I just wanted to bring that and juxtapose that with some of the things that I've encountered. Not only, and again, fast forward today, we still have this this notion of when we use certain terminologies, we associate them with a certain ethnic group, and we have to be extremely cautious as educators, especially within our spaces, where our teaching spaces, whether it's a health and or physical education spaces. So I just want to bring that example for me. Thank you.
Excellent. So the third question I have for us in the panel is thinking about sort of the experiences that each of us have had, and in particular, the fact that we spend a lot of time in introspection, and I think a lot of time in reflection. So with that being said, the question for us next to sort of tackle on is, how deeply have you personally examined your own prejudices? How deeply have you examined your biases and intersectionality as it relates to being an anti-racist physical education teacher? Tilsa.
That is an incredible question. So Victor shared something personal. I will share a little something personal about how I came to even become a physical education teacher and later on an administrator. I grew up in the Bronx, and my stepfather was a physical education teacher, and he worked in the South Bronx. And anyone who knows anything about the Bronx, you know that the South Bronx in the 80s was a place that was very stereotypical. You know, it was assumed by a lot of people as a terrible place, a ghetto, a place where there was, you know, it was riddled with crime. And he worked in a school, and he decided that he wanted me to go to school with him. And in going to school with him, he, you know, teachers back then also made a lot less money. And as we do even today, they work multiple jobs. And so he looked for an alternative job, and he decided to start a tennis program because he figured that he could bring his stepdaughter with him. And there was an organization, and this is not a plug for the organization, but there was an organization that is still around by a new name in New York City that decided that they wanted to build, and they wanted to have this grassroots efforts in an area of the Bronx that was notorious for crack at the time. And so my stepfather was the site supervisor for these tennis courts, and that's where I learned to play. And eventually those tennis courts became a site that that hosted tournaments. And so there was a small parking area, and there were people that came from Westchester. There were people that came from Queens. There were people that came from all over the place, affluent neighborhoods. And no one knew that these tennis courts were there. And so after a while, I didn't realize the significance of these tennis courts. And it wasn't until I later became a teacher that I realized what my stepfather did. And then I realized the part of just history and how I was given an opportunity to do something that normally and statistically I shouldn't have been able to do. And so when I think about my biases and when I think about my experiences, I think back to those tennis courts. They're not there anymore. And my stepfather has long since retired. And if you didn't know that they were there, you would never know. You would never know that experience. And when I look at the other people that played and that were on the teams, and I looked at the opportunities I was afforded, and I think about my biases, it helps me to remember that I have to be the bridge to help both sides. Because I, as an Afro-Latina woman that I identify, it took me a long time to even decide how to identify, because people didn't know what I was. And so I got thrown into various different groups. And then playing tennis, I was around people that didn't necessarily always look like me. And I had experiences, I had a chance to go to places and be a part of things that statistically I was in what, and Brian, I love this in your book, I've been reading white spaces. So I had the opportunity to be exposed to some place that I normally should not have been. And so eventually when it was time for me to go to college, I did play at the college level. And there was a debate whether or not I would go to a school where, you know, my ethnicity would be honored, or I would go someplace where I might have difficult situations. And so I'm a Jasper, and that's great. And there were times where I have to tell you it was difficult. And the reason that I'm sharing all of this is because it would be easy through all of those situations for me to develop stereotypes right back against other people that assumed things about me. It would be very easy for me to make assumptions about other people because of things that I saw. And when I entered into their space, how I was previously treated. And so when I think about my opportunity now and the story that I shared about looking at the equipment and looking at what is available, that is where my motivation came from. My motivation came from the fact that I was given a chance to do something. And so my biases are checked, because if a person that I encounter is not so nice or says or does something, I just assume that they don't know better. And it's my job to help them to know better, because when we know better, we do better. And then the other end, I will be very honest, it's also my job and my biases to check, well, why doesn't that parent just do this? Why does that parent? Because it's very easy for us to judge how someone spends their money and what they do. So it's very easy to judge to the left and judge to the right, the people who have too much and the people who maybe don't have enough. Well, why don't they just? Or why would they come here? And so it's very, very important to reflect on, well, everybody makes decisions, but at the end of the day, every parent wants what's best for their child. Every parent wants to be able to say that they've given their child something, and every parent, I believe, wants their child to do just a little bit better than them. You better the race. There's a saying in Spanish, and I'm not fluent, but there is an expression that talks about bettering the race. And so it's important for me to check my own attitudes about what I think is a space that someone may or may not belong in, because that's not for me to judge. It's my job to provide access so that someone can have an experience, and then in that experience, they can build on who they are. Because I'm an unlikely. Anyone who sees what I do now would probably say, who? She does what? And so because I'm an unlikely, I use that to help me remember, well, I have to check my biases. I have to check my attitudes and those things, because stereotypes are sometimes rooted in a little bit of truth, and sometimes our experiences. It's important for us to forgive and let go of those things, and to start fresh constantly and say, how am I providing access? because access is the most important thing. That's how you break down these systems. That's how you challenge the norm, by providing access, and you make way for people to be able to come in who normally would not be in these spaces deemed a white space.
Very powerful. Thank you very much. Ronnie.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for that. Tilsa, I'm going to jump right into one of the last comments that Tilsa made regarding Hispanics. And, I am very fluent in Spanish, as Spanish is my first language. So as I stated earlier, I was born in the Dominican Republic. And for some of you, just quick geography, that is the oldest continuous European settlement in the entire Western Hemisphere. So it has a very pivotal historical context to the whole race construct, racism, and colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. To that end, I was brought up with very much so racist values. I was brought up to believe that Haitian people were not at the same human level as we are, that they spoke a different language that was subpar to ours, that their beliefs, their values, their hygiene, everything. So I'm in for a while. Once I came to the United States in third grade, my first PE teacher, Mr. Grant, African American male, exposed me to James Baldwin, Malcolm X, and a library of amazing philosophers, activists who transformed my perspective at what race is, the country, and the historical context within that. I went through a period of self-hatred where I did not want any association with my European heritage in any way, shape, or form. I got into it with my parents. I ended up, my lifelong partner of over 20 years. We have 2 children who are deeply melanated African-American kids, almost to spite my mom and my culture. Here you go. So much for blanquismo. So blanquismo, that burdening the race, was a policy of the Dominican Republic under dictator Trujillo, who was backed by the US to make the race, as they say, better, or in essence, closer to white. I had to grapple with that. If I didn't grapple and go on to that, that was going to show up in my teaching practices. When I went to Cortland, which is a predominantly white institution, I fell right in. Personally, I can tell the story of race from 2 different perspectives. My personal perspective, I came to this country, I learned the English language in 1 year. Ms. Schneider wrote at the end of my senior year that I was going to be the future president of the United States. So to say this, I got exalted. I got treated very exceptionally. I got assimilated to culture. I played football, so very much assimilated to American culture. Played that in middle school, high school, and at Cortland, Erie Community College as well. So I can tell a story from that side, but in my personal life, I've also been arrested. I've also been told by a police officer that they wish they would have shown up to the scene and killed me on the spot. I've also been called racial slurs. So I can see this whole mantra and how the mindset of human beings, the conditioning that they've been brought up, leads to how they treat others, respect one another, their degree of empathy, compassion, their ability to think critically. If you don't examine yourself, the context in which you were brought in, and just assume I'm anti-racist because I say I am, or because I've never called someone this, or no, you have to really understand that this construct has been around for over 500 years. It is pervasive at every level of human existence, and it is a global phenomenon. Unless you are in the Andaman Islands off of the Indian coast, and human beings who have been secluded and not exposed to that, but even there, if you're not part of that tribe, you can't come in, as people who have tried have been literally killed on the spot. So understanding the human condition, that this is not, when we start to talk about these things, this is not a personal attack on anyone, but a acknowledgement that the social construct that is race has had real life implications to all human beings. All of it, everyone is affected by this. Some might profit from it or seemingly benefit from it, but at the core, None of us in our human collective would ever move forward until this is eradicated. This cannot be eradicated if we, at the very first, acknowledge that it is 100% a real thing, a lived reality that is not up for debate, and that we all have a stake in it, regardless of how we are identified under that lens. It affects all of us. So we have to have the difficult conversations. What were your dinner conversations with your parents? How did your uncles, aunts, the social groups that what were the comments made? What do you, when I came back from Portland, I learned tremendously as to how to be the best PE teacher that I can be. But again, the constructs in which I was brought up under and some of the experiences that I had there when I first got to the South Bronx and taught at PS 457X in the South Bronx, 167 Sharon Avenue for 6 years. My very 4 months, I was afraid of some of my students. I had internalized some of the stereotypes about Black males and this is gonna, because my experience was not quite that. And then had to reflect, wait a minute, Ronnie, you come from poverty. You come from places where considered ghetto. In Dominican Republic, you came from a shanty house. You know what it's like to not know when you're gonna eat again. And sometimes taking things that aren't yours because of the construct that brought you into. I had to reflect on all of my experiences to grant myself the humanity, not continue to beat myself up for things that I had no control over. Where I was born, the color of my skin, the country I was born to, the socioeconomic class I was born under, my sexuality, any of that. These are things that are part of just the cards I was dealt. Accept myself, be at peace with myself. So now I don't judge anyone, regardless of how they present and the cards that have been dealt to them. So what I'm modeling to you, although some of the statements that I make may be controversial, but it is my reality, and modeling, being vulnerable and expressing that, yes, we all have a stake in this and have to reflect on how we show up in our classroom spaces. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Dr. Ramsey.
Indeed. One of the models by which I live by is that education is a quest from the cradle to the grave. We never stop learning. There's always opportunities for growth. Hence, even when we prepare our lessons, we always should reflect that no lesson is perfect, and there are opportunities for improving this lesson and improving our practices. Many of our listening audience here are from states where clearly it's not a secret that some of the anti-racist practices may be subject to pushback and or non-acceptance by some of our colleagues. That's the reality. I have to put that out there. Some of the ways in which I explore a little in a deeper side, coming again from Panama. I just want to put that out there since my friend said Dominican Republic and Spanish and all that. So I got to plug that in. And thank you, Tilsa, for bringing up Jaspers, because we always talk about culture. Anyway, that's another conversation. But one of the things that I found that that was important for me was the issue or the notion of code switching. That is a skill set that many people to this day have not mastered. And code switching was something that I found myself having to perfect to some degree, depending on where I was, just to, again, fit in. But then I thought about this as I reflect, which is something that I want to encourage each and every one of us to continue to do. If you do, and if you don't, please make that a practice, in which you're not saying who you are, or you're not professing to who you are if you don't speak the manner that you speak. And then I thought about the many great leaders like the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was an exceptional orator, who spoke with a patois accent, and clearly had nothing to do with his accent. So when I thought about code switching and trying to fit in, i.e. with the manner in which I enunciated certain words, I had to deepen my understanding in saying, well, I mean, depending on where I am, I need to be cautious of how I approach that, not to come across as if I am different or better than someone else. And I learned that early on in my professional career. And again, that's something that I had to learn about myself and deepen my understanding about that. So I don't want to expand too much and add to what my esteemed colleague Ronnie talked about, but these are some of the things that, again, many of our participants here may have difficulty dealing with when they go back to their teaching spaces. So reflecting on your own values and how you welcome others into your space, and be mindful that there are opportunities for learning from those missteps. I use it personally and it helped me. And it's something that I always live by. If I don't know something, I ask. And when I divulge an information that someone may not be privy to, for example, as of late, a very good friend of mine, I just want you to be mindful that also when I thought about the many, I don't want to say, I want to say co-conspirators throughout history, like John Brown and William Wilberforce, Howard Zinn, and all these people who I follow and lead, who, by the way, were white people who fought against certain systemic racism. The latter one being Howard Zinn, who did an amazing job out in Ohio, I believe, at university out there, Wilberforce. So I thought about, how do I convey an information to my friend of a misstep that I have had in the past, where I used language that was inappropriate, related to something about someone's ethnic background. And I will not repeat it here. But when the person used the term, another term, it was an opportunity for me to reflect and say, you know, I made that mistake. So I didn't know that. And I am now going to help this person and teach this person that terminology, it's not appropriate to use within this setting. And hopefully we don't use that term within our teaching spaces. Therefore, let's be mindful of when we reflect what we say and what we do, and make certain that we don't have that issue happen. So again, from a deeper perspective, I've always reflected on what have I said, what have I done, and what can I do to make things better as I move forward as a pedagogue, as an instructor, as someone who is teaching future professionals, so that I will be honest with them and say, hey, here are some of the mistakes that I made, and I'm going to share them with you, and I want to be transparent with you. And that's something that I believe that our participants here can do in a very amicable way, but yet in a teachable and assertive manner. Because there was a conversation that Sister Carolyn Randall Williams talked about last night, when the topic arose about the various the curriculum, not a secret, in Florida. And she said an atrocity is an atrocity. She brought it back. She talked about the Jewish Holocaust. She brought it about the African diaspora. She talked about the Native Americans. She tied it together and said, hey, if we're going to share the inhumane treatment of one group of people, we have to be honest with everyone and be honest about the historical perspective. As some of you already know, signed into law monuments honoring Emmett Till and his mother. So that's another conversation that may or may not come up in some of our spaces. And while it may not be a social studies environment, it might be a student that come from one of the states that the monuments were either torn down and or put up. So these are things that we need to again examine ourselves. And I will urge everyone here to reflect on your own practice and learn from your own missteps and misdeeds, and make life better for everyone.
Well, that is excellent. That is a perfect transition to us having the opportunity to chat in some of our spaces. And I think one thing to sort of keep in mind as we sort of move on here, particularly with the last question, is that identity, power, and history make a difference. They are powerful, even in situations where we're now trying to suppress all three of those particular types of things. They do make a difference in terms of creating a climate for our students, first of all, but being real with yourself, second of all, and third, providing a quality physical education experience that people can use as we try to promote more positive communities. So before I get on my soapbox with that, I am going to go ahead and give us the ground rules for the breakout rooms. And then we're going to have about 30 minutes or so to sort of kind of talk. You'll get one of us. If you don't get the person you think you want to be with, it's okay. We can exchange numbers afterwards and contact information. But we're going to spend some short time sort of talking to smaller groups, because I think that's a very important part of this process as well. So let me get that up, get the ground rules up, and we'll get rolling here. All right. So everyone should see our ground rules. I mean, these are things that you've probably seen in some form or fashion before if you've done any type of in-service work or discussion. So the first thing to sort of keep in mind is when we have these conversations, this is a safe zone. So individualism is celebrated, and whatever happens in these particular walls stay here. Second is engage with people in the process. Please be present. Third, virtual hand raise if there's a question. I think that'll kind of keep people from just shouting out, because we want to make sure everybody's voice gets heard. Fourth, don't be afraid to speak from your own experience. Okay, we're here. I think we appreciate the fact that we're authentic, and we'd like you to be authentic as well. Number 5 is very important. The goal is not to agree necessarily, but to foster understanding, because we know that any challenges, issues, policies, we're not going to get it fixed in the next few minutes, but it's something for us to think about for future understanding. As I remind you again, please put your questions or comments in the chat, because we can kind of work both things here with the vocal discussions, but also in chat. Be mindful of other people's times and level of understanding. So again, remember, we've got about 30 minutes or so. So if you're a person who may think you may go on a little bit of a, what I usually call a jazz riff, if you're like my students who just sit there and talk, keep in mind that there's other people who may want to contribute to the conversation as well. Again, maintain confidentiality. And then feel free to disagree with ideas, but not people, and respect the differences of opinion. And we will be back here at about 7:05, and then we'll go to our last task, which is sort of wrapping up discussion. I think what we will need in terms of each group in order to help us out as well, if someone wants to designate themselves as a note taker, right? That would be helpful. So when we get back to the breakout groups, that we can see if we have some common things that we've sort of discussed here. So let me stop talking. And
thank you, Brian.
And let's get to it.
Yes, so let's get to it. So if everyone can see in the chat, I just dropped in the link for the actual breakout rooms. Currently, we are in a Zoom meeting. So let's go ahead and hop on to that next link of Zoom so that we can get these breakout discussions going. Thank you, everyone.